There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles in when you have spent months, maybe years, trying to make a relationship work, while quietly feeling like you are disappearing. You give your patience, you adjust your boundaries, you second-guess your reactions because you genuinely want to be fair. Yet no matter how carefully you navigate the conversation, no matter how much you compromise, something always feels off. The ground beneath you never seems solid. You wake up tired. You carry a low hum of anxiety throughout the day. You find yourself explaining your own feelings to yourself, wondering why a connection that was supposed to bring safety now leaves you feeling fragile and constantly on edge. That exhaustion is real. It is not a sign that you are too sensitive. It is a sign that you have been carrying a weight that was never yours to hold. You were not the problem. The dynamic you were in was structured around imbalance, and that imbalance was maintained through quiet, consistent manipulation that rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with shouting or obvious cruelty. It arrives in small moments, in subtle shifts, in patterns that wear you down slowly until you no longer recognize your own footing. Understanding what actually happens in these dynamics requires looking past the surface arguments and into the underlying psychology. The behavior you experienced was not about love, partnership, or mutual growth. It was about control, ego preservation, and the quiet maintenance of a superior position. When someone cannot tolerate true emotional equality, they will unconsciously or deliberately create an environment where the other person is kept uncertain, dependent, or diminished. This is not always a loud campaign. More often, it is a slow erosion. The mind does this to protect itself from vulnerability, from accountability, and from the fear of being seen as ordinary. The result is a relationship that looks functional from the outside, but feels like walking through fog from the inside. You were not failing. You were being systematically unbalanced. Once you recognize the architecture of that process, the confusion begins to lift. What felt like random cruelty reveals itself as predictable patterns. What felt like your personal shortcomings reveals itself as a carefully maintained dynamic. The following patterns are not isolated incidents. They are connected. They serve a single purpose, and recognizing them is the first step toward reclaiming your clarity. The first pattern you may have noticed is the quiet undermining of your confidence and your progress. This does not usually look like direct criticism. It looks like a sigh when you share good news. It looks like a quick redirection when you talk about your goals. It looks like compliments that come with a subtle condition attached, or praise that is immediately followed by a reminder of your past mistakes. The psychology behind this is straightforward. Your growth threatens their sense of control. When you become more capable, more independent, or more secure in your own judgment, the power dynamic shifts. To prevent that shift, they introduce doubt in measured doses. They do not need to destroy you openly. They only need to keep you slightly unsure of your own footing. The impact on you is gradual but profound. You begin to hold back your enthusiasm. You stop sharing your wins. You start apologizing for taking up space. Over time, you train yourself to be smaller, quieter, and more cautious. Not because you lack ability, but because the environment punished your visibility. Recognizing this is not about anger. It is about noticing how your natural confidence was slowly conditioned to shrink. The second pattern is isolation disguised as protection. This begins subtly. They might express mild concern about a friend who seems overly critical. They might suggest that your family does not truly understand you. They might point out that certain people in your life are unreliable or selfish, framing their observations as care. Slowly, the message becomes clear. The people around you are flawed, but they are the steady, reliable constant. This is not coincidence. It is dependency engineering. Human beings are resilient when they have multiple sources of validation and support. A person who needs control understands this. By gently pulling you away from your support system, they remove the external perspectives that could challenge their narrative. You are left with only their version of reality. The impact is a quiet loneliness that you may not even recognize as abnormal. You start doubting your own social instincts. You withdraw from invitations. You convince yourself that you just prefer a smaller circle. But the truth is that your safety net was carefully dismantled so that you would have nowhere else to land when confusion set in.
When you step back now, you can see that this was never about protecting you. It was about ensuring you had no one to compare notes with. The third pattern involves the steady distortion of your reality. You remember a conversation clearly. They remember it completely differently. You recall a promise they made. They insist it never happened. You bring up something that hurt you, and the details are rearranged until the focus shifts entirely onto your reaction rather than the original event. This is not simple forgetfulness. This is the induction of cognitive dissonance. When two people cannot agree on basic facts, the mind naturally searches for a resolution. If one person remains calm, consistent, and unyielding in their altered version, the other person begins to question their own memory. The psychology here relies on your natural desire for harmony and your willingness to take responsibility for friction. They know that if they hold their ground while you feel uncertain, you will eventually concede. You will apologize for misremembering. You will soften your stance. You will start keeping mental notes, replaying conversations in your head, trying to prove your own sanity to yourself. The impact is a chronic state of mental fatigue. You stop trusting your own perception. You walk into conversations bracing for correction rather than connection. Your internal compass becomes misaligned, not because it is broken, but because it was constantly recalibrated by someone else. Clarity returns when you stop trying to win the argument over what happened and start trusting the consistency of your own experience. The fourth pattern is the deliberate provocation of emotional reactions, followed by blame. You will notice a rhythm. Tension builds through subtle comments, withdrawn warmth, or unexplained criticism. You stay patient. You try to communicate. The pressure continues until you finally react. You raise your voice. You cry. You set a firm boundary in frustration. The moment you show emotion, the dynamic flips instantly. You become the unstable one. You become the source of the conflict. Your reaction becomes the entire story, and the original provocation disappears from the narrative. This is projection and blame shifting working in tandem. The psychology is simple. Emotions are messy, and a person who avoids accountability will always use your visible frustration as proof that you are the problem. They do not need to create the initial tension consistently. They only need to wait until you can no longer absorb it quietly. The impact on you is a deep sense of guilt and self-recrimination. You replay the moment you lost your composure and convince yourself that you ruined everything. You apologize. You overcorrect. You promise to stay calmer next time, even though the setup was designed to push you past your threshold. You carry the weight of their emotional regulation as if it were your job to manage. When you recognize this cycle, you see that your reaction was not the cause. It was the expected outcome of a pressure system you were never meant to withstand. The fifth pattern is strategic withdrawal during your most vulnerable moments. You become ill. You face a loss. You go through a period of stress or uncertainty. Instead of stepping in with steady support,
You notice a noticeable absence. Communication becomes sparse. Empathy feels conditional. The focus remains on their own schedule, their own discomfort, or their own need for space. This is not always framed as rejection. It is often framed as you being too needy, or as them needing to protect their own energy. The psychology behind it is a test of loyalty, combined with a quiet assertion of power. Withholding care when you are at your lowest sends a clear message. You are responsible for your own survival. You must prove your worth through patience, and you must accept that support is not guaranteed. It teaches you to expect less. It conditions you to stop asking. The impact is a quiet reshaping of your emotional expectations. You learn to handle pain alone. You stop reaching out. You convince yourself that independence is strength, when in reality, you were simply adapting to an environment where care was transactional. Over time, you forget what it feels like to be met with steady presence. You normalize emotional scarcity. Healing begins when you allow yourself to grieve that absence without making it your fault, and when you recognize that true partnership does not disappear when life becomes difficult. The sixth pattern is the quiet preparation for an exit while keeping you emotionally invested. You may notice subtle shifts. They begin making plans that do not include you. They invest time and energy into external validation, new friendships, or personal projects that gradually create distance. Yet, when you pull back, they return just enough warmth to keep you hopeful. They drop hints about the future. They remind you of the good times. They maintain just enough connection to prevent you from fully detaching. This is control over the narrative and the timeline. The psychology is rooted in risk management. They do not want to lose their source of validation, stability, or convenience until they have securely established their next phase. They keep you in a state of suspended uncertainty because uncertainty breeds compliance. You keep adjusting. You keep waiting for clarity. You keep believing that if you just understand them better, things will stabilize. The impact is a prolonged state of emotional limbo. You invest energy into a connection that is already being quietly phased out. You mistake their intermittent warmth for progress when it is actually a maintenance strategy. You delay your own healing because you are waiting for a resolution that they are not offering. When you step back and look at the timeline, you can see that their detachment began long before the official ending. You were not blindsided. You were kept in place while they prepared to move forward. Recognizing this allows you to stop waiting for closure from someone who has already decided to leave, and to start building your own forward momentum. These patterns do not exist in isolation. They work together. They create an environment where your confidence is quietly reduced, your support system is gently removed, your memory is consistently challenged, your reactions are weaponized, your vulnerability is met with absence, and your attachment is maintained just enough to keep you in place. None of this requires loud confrontation. It only requires consistency. It only requires a person who is more invested in maintaining control than in building genuine connection. When you see the full picture, the confusion lifts. You stop asking what you did wrong. You stop searching for the exact moment things changed. You recognize that the change was not an event. It was a process. A slow, deliberate process of erosion that relied on your willingness to keep trying, keep explaining, keep hoping. That willingness is not a flaw. It is a reflection of your capacity for care. It is also the very thing they relied on. Recognizing this does not require bitterness. It requires clarity. You do not need to prove your pain.
You do not need to convince them of what they did. You only need to accept the reality of what you experienced and allow that reality to guide your next steps. The shift from confusion to awareness begins with stepping back emotionally. You stop trying to decode the behavior in real time. You stop treating every interaction as a puzzle to be solved. You start observing the patterns instead of reacting to the moments. You notice what is consistently absent. You notice what is consistently redirected. You notice how your own energy changes in their presence. This is not about building a case. It is about rebuilding your trust in your own perception. When you stop trying to win their approval, you reclaim your attention. When you stop explaining yourself to someone who is not listening, you reclaim your energy. When you stop treating intermittent warmth as proof of change, you reclaim your peace. Awareness is quiet. It does not arrive with dramatic realizations. It arrives as a steady recognition of what has been true all along. You were not failing. You were adapting to an environment that was never designed to support you. That recognition is not an end point. It is a foundation. From that foundation, empowerment becomes possible. It does not look like confrontation. It does not look like proving a point. It looks like boundaries that are calm, consistent, and non-negotiable. It looks like choosing silence over explanation. It looks like stepping away from arguments that are designed to drain you. It looks like refusing to participate in cycles that keep you uncertain. Calm detachment is not coldness. It is self-respect in motion. It is the decision to stop trading your peace for the illusion of resolution. You do not need their acknowledgement to validate your experience. You do not need their apology to justify your boundaries. You only need to align your actions with your well-being. When you stop feeding the dynamic loses its fuel. When you stop expecting different results from the same patterns, you free yourself from repetition. You begin to treat your energy as something to be protected, not something to be offered as proof of loyalty. This is how you rebuild your center. Not through grand declarations, but through quiet, consistent choices that reflect your own worth. Healing does not require erasing the past. It requires integrating it. You acknowledge what happened without letting it define your future. You recognize the patterns without studying them endlessly. You allow yourself to grieve the time, the energy, the trust that was misplaced. And then you redirect your focus toward what is actually present. Peace comes when you stop fighting a reality that has already shown you its truth. Strength comes when you stop waiting for permission to protect yourself. Moving forward is not about becoming someone new. It is about returning to someone you were always capable of being. A person who trusts their own judgment. A person who recognizes imbalance early. A person who chooses clarity over confusion and stillness over chaos. You do not need to prove that you survived this. You only need to live well after it. Your experience is valid. Your exhaustion was real. Your confusion was manufactured. Your clarity is earned. And from this point forward, you are no longer navigating someone else's design. You are building your own.